Hello. Today we're going to look at producing your own seed. So why produce your own seed? The first thing that comes to mind for most people is, of course, cost. If you're not buying seeds, particularly if you've got to go a long way to go and collect your seed, you're going to make an economic saving. But more importantly for me is this: if you produce your own seeds on your own ground, what will happen generation after generation is that the seeds that succeed on your ground will produce seed which will succeed on your ground over and over again, and slowly but surely your plants will be basically adapting generation after generation to where they're growing, so they will be more successful, more productive, and simply easier to grow. So that's the reason for me why we produce our own seed. So now let's look at some of the things we need to consider if we're going to produce our own seed. We now know that this kind of self-selection and adaptation to your green space is important when you're saving your own seeds. But there are a few things we need to think about when considering producing our own seeds. First thing I want to look at is pollination. Now, a lot of plants are what I call auto-fertile, and they can fertilize themselves to produce seeds. But an awful lot of other plants actually need to be pollinated by another plant. For example, courgette. If you have one courgette plant and there aren't any others nearby in your neighbour's gardens or whatever, you won't get any courgettes or any seeds. So you need more than one individual normally to ensure pollination. Check with your garden shop when you buy your plants or your seeds what you need for pollination. Sometimes it's straightforward, it's just other plants planted nearby. Sometimes it's a little bit more complicated. Next is F1 hybrids. Now, if you buy seeds or a plant where you have a mention of F1 hybrid, this cannot really be used to produce seeds for the following year. Well, it can be used for producing seeds, but you really don't know what you're going to get. I've done a video on F1 hybrids, which you'll find right at the end of the music of this video, if that interests you. It goes into a little bit more detail. I don't go into deep detail in genetics and stuff like that, because we don't really need to know it, but it gives you a little bit more idea of what F1 hybrids are. So, simply, in a nutshell, we don't use F1 hybrids for producing seed. I'm coming back to pollination, and specifically what I call crossing. Now, if you have a plant, for example a lettuce, you want it to be pollinated by another lettuce and what we call breed true, which means that it will produce seeds that will produce the same lettuce over and over again. So if you have the lettuce pollinated by its counterpart, which is of the same variety, it will breed true and produce seeds which will produce this lettuce over and over again. However, if you have a different variety growing nearby that pollinates your lettuce, for example, it may actually produce some very, very bizarre results the following year. In fact, it may well produce not much at all. it'll probably produce something which might be inedible. So you want to try and avoid that, unless you're feeling particularly adventurous. You really want to avoid that because, as I said, you're going to get some very strange results. Just a little word about members of the melon pumpkin family, which includes things like gherkins and marrows, plus various other squashes and so on. There is just a little danger that they cross with decorative gourds, which are in the same family, and this can actually produce toxic offspring, which can make you ill, or some can be extremely toxic, and if you eat enough of them, can even kill you. So to be avoided. Another thing to consider, specifically with lettuce here as an example, I have growing here, just behind me, I noticed, this plant. Now this plant doesn't really look very much, does it? It's a little weedy, thin thing. But that's actually wild lettuce. And it produces, as you can see, leaves which are not particularly interesting, and they are quite bitter. Now this has actually happened to me, whereby I've had wild lettuce growing near my cultivated lettuce, and they've both flowered at the same time, and this wild lettuce has pollinated my cultivated lettuce. I kept the seeds, and the following year that produced a plant which looked like a kind of spiky lettuce, but which was completely inedible. So again, think about crossing. Keep one variety in one place, and if you do want to grow two varieties of, for example, lettuce, keep them well apart in the garden. Keep them as far away as possible. Also, always check around you in your neighbours' gardens. If just over the fence they've got lettuces growing, maybe it would be a good idea to grow your lettuces somewhere else in the garden. So consider cross-pollination and the difficulties that could engender. The last thing I want to talk about is grafting. So what is grafting? Well, basically it's often used for things like fruit trees. And the idea is this: I'll use my prop, which is a little blue pen. Basically we take a tree, represented by the pen, and what we do is we graft, which means we attach, if you wish, a different tree on the top. Now you might say, why do we do this? The reason is this: the bottom part here, often called the rootstock, is chosen because it will convey certain properties to the fruit tree. It may mean that it's going to be more robust, more resistant to disease or to drought or to wet conditions, or it might simply be something aesthetic, like it'll produce a column plant or a dwarf plant, or a very, very productive plant, for example. And the top tree, which is called the scion, is the part that actually produces the fruit. This is chosen because it produces particularly good fruit, for example. Now here we have a combination of, in fact, two plants. We have the bottom part, which is what we call the rootstock, and the top part, which is the bit which is producing the features that we want, for example, fruit. This is very, very common with things like apple trees and cherries and pears, for example. So, if this top part produces fruit, so we have lots of lovely apples, for example, it's producing seeds for this tree only, not for the rootstock. Remember, we have in fact two trees which have been in effect glued together. So the seeds will only produce this, So when we plant them, we're not going to get the rootstock plus the scion of these two different trees, the bottom bit and the top bit. We're only going to get the top bit, which might not be quite as robust or have the same features as its parent, which was grafted onto this rootstock, this other tree. So again, a thing to remember when sowing things like pips from apples or from pears or cherry stones or whatever. We've looked at things we need to consider when producing seeds, and normally for the pollination, nature takes care of things. But what we need to look at now is, how do we collect these seeds? So this is the how-to part of the video. So for that, we need to go indoors. In front of me, I have a number of little cherry tomatoes. And what I'm going to do is take the seeds out of these cherry tomatoes and then put them on this kitchen paper and leave them in a dry, airy place out of full sun where they can dry out. Now this operation is valid for tomatoes, but it's also valid for lots of other what I call moist seeds, such as melon, cucumber, pumpkin, and so on. It's also valid for what I call dry seeds, things like sunflower, leaving them to dry a little bit more for a couple of days before putting them away in storage for next year is often a good idea. So now, let's take a closer look at the operation. One little note, where you leave these seeds to dry, ensure it's not a place where little creatures from the garden are going to come along and eat them. So possibly not on the windowsill or in the garden. It's usually a good idea to let them dry out somewhere airy in the house. But as I said, not in full sun. Okay, so let's take a closer look. I'm going to seed just one of these little tomatoes because it's the same operation repeated for all the others. So here we have a little tomato which is already open. Now you can just simply squeeze the seeds out like this. In fact, I think that's what I'm going to do, because why complicate matters? And literally all we do is put them onto this tissue. So literally squeeze them out like this, try and spread them around a little bit, and there we are. They will slowly start to dry out pretty much as they hit the paper. Throw away, or even better still, eat the flesh of the tomato which is left. And again, we'll do the same thing, still a few little seeds here, and drop them out like that. Now what will happen is, over the next couple of days, they will dry out, but one thing is you'll find they'll stick to the paper. Now you can remove them, or simply, as I do, leave them stuck to the paper. It's no real big deal, because in next spring you will then have the little seeds stuck to the paper, and you can actually just rip off bits of the paper, just rip off little pieces with the seed and plant that whole. The paper will just decompose in the soil. Or alternatively, if you want to, you can just pick them off the paper. So there we are. This, as I said, works for lots of different plants, particularly tomatoes. There is an alternative with tomatoes. This jelly, which is around the seeds here, if you can see it, but I'm sure if you open a tomato you'll see it immediately. It's actually there to inhibit the germination of the seed. This is why it's really important to remove it, to dry it off. there is another operation you can do with tomatoes. And this is by simply filling a jar with water, or semi-filling a jar with water, and putting the seeds in here. Leave it for about 3 or 4 days. It'll start to froth up a little bit. And then you can remove the seeds, use something like a tea strainer, and then put the dried seeds onto the paper as we've just done. And there we are. That's one thing specific to tomatoes, but I'm just going to put them straight on the paper like this and just let the warmth and air do its work to dry these out. Here we have a sunflower, and again the same operation as with the tomato. We need to take the seeds and put them on this kitchen paper. Now sunflower seeds are relatively dry. Here we have what is left of the little flowers that made up the big head of the sunflower. And we can just literally brush those off. If the sunflower is fully mature, we can just brush them off. Notice this sunflower has already been used as a source of food by various birds and things in the garden, so there are actually some seeds missing. But that's fine, because the sunflowers that I breed are actually for feeding the wildlife and the birds in the garden. So what do we need to do? We need to just rub off these little flower heads. As I said, I'm doing this in the garden because it can be quite a messy operation. If you're doing it indoors, make sure you have your vacuum cleaner ready. Excuse me, I'm just going to shake that. Try not to lose too many seeds. Again, maybe we'll clean this out too. There we have our towel. So then we just literally, with a little bit of pressure, you can see we have lots and lots of seeds that come off. It's also mixed up with other bits of dried sunflower. So we have very much the seeds here, but also we have little bits of other stuff. It doesn't really matter, to be honest. People like to have just pure clean seeds, and I can understand that, but here it's just mixed up with bits of dried old sunflower, and if that gets sown in the ground with the seeds, it'll actually not have a negative effect. In fact, it'll be a slightly positive effect, because it'll decompose and provide food for the soil. So don't worry about being a little bit messy. The whole idea of this operation is simply to get the seeds from the head onto the paper towel. I won't continue with this, I can do that later. But basically, as you can see, you have a nice number of seeds there. One flower head will produce an enormous amount of seeds, and as I said, spread them thinly, maybe even use a number of these. Leave it for a couple of days, as we said with the tomatoes, to dry out a little, and then you can literally pick up this whole piece of kitchen towel and put it where you're going to let it store over winter. So there we have the sunflower. So here are our tomato seeds. They've been on the paper for a couple of days, and you can see they're completely dried out. So now we need to think about where we can put them to stock them until next spring when we want to plant them. Well, a very simple option is this: a jar with a lid. Now notice in the bottom of this jar here there is some rice. I put some rice grains in there. And there is a reason for this. We worry about a number of things when we're stocking seeds. One of them is moisture. If moisture gets onto the seeds and stays there for a certain while, the seeds can actually just go mouldy during the winter months. So if we put a bit of rice in the bottom of the jar, the rice will absorb any moisture in the air and keep the seeds dry. So what do we need to do? Well, simply, we take our jar, take the top of it, we take our paper with the seeds on it, and as I said, this is using tomato seeds, which are very much stuck to the paper. You just literally stick the paper in the jar and close it. This will also keep out small rodents too, which particularly like eating seeds. If you have drier seeds on your paper that are not actually attached to the paper, you can just pull the seeds into the jar if you want, or alternatively leave them with the paper too. So that's the way to overwinter our seeds in a jar. You can also, and put that to one side, use simply a paper bag. Same idea, I was just putting the rice in the bottom and you put your seeds directly in the bag. But here, as you can see, there's not really very much protection against things like rodents. So I would suggest, if you keep your seeds in bags, to put the bags in something fairly robust and solid, like a metal tin, for example. Another thing to do with both the bag and our jar is put a label on them, because you may well recognize your seeds in spring, but then again you may not. So if you've got the name on there saying tomato seeds, you'll know you've got tomato seeds here. So that's the way to stock them for the winter. So that's it for producing our own seeds. Just a couple of little afterthoughts. If you are keeping your own seeds, I always suggest keep the seeds from a number of flowers to hedge your bets, to ensure that you have seeds which will actually germinate from one or other of the plants, but also it keeps a certain genetic diversity, even if it is from the same variety. It keeps a little bit of genetic diversity for the following year. The other thing is crossing. As I said in the video, we tend to leave that to the professionals, and that's how they develop new varieties, by crossing plants over and over again over very many generations. But if you want to try a little bit of crossing and you have a little corner of your garden where it doesn't matter if things grow or not, or you have some rather unusual surprises, then why not? It can be fun too. As far as growing your own seeds or buying your own seeds from a seed supplier, the choice is yours. I personally do both. So, happy seed production and happy gardening.